be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, CSC Study. Threatening domains are targeting the top 10 most valuable brands. My name is Christy DeMeo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is David Barnett. David Barnett is Head of Consultancy Brand Monitoring for CSC and provides consultancy guidance to global customers in various industries on matters relating to online brand protection. David has been working in the brand protection industry for more than 18 years. David regularly speaks at events, contributes to articles, and is the author of the book, Brand Protection in the Online World. And with that, let's welcome David.
Thanks, Christy. So first of all, just want to go over what we're planning to cover today. So firstly, we'll go through the study methodology, which will include an introduction to our 3D domain security and enforcement technology and our DomainSec platform, which is the CSC technology we use to do these types of analysis. I'll then spend quite a lot of time going through the findings themselves, which will look at the domain activity, the different brand variant types we saw in the domains we picked up, the top features within the domain data set. Then we'll talk about some cybersecurity, some fraud protection, and some brand protection observations amongst those domains that we found. And then I'll talk a little bit specifically about the homoglyph domains that we found within the data set. And then finally, we'll move on to the summary and some key takeaways. So firstly, we're going to go over the study methodology. So in this study, we're going to be looking at domains with names similar to any of the top 10 most valuable company brands in 2022. And you can see there the list of the 10 brands that we've looked at. When we talk about similar domain names, there's a few categories of sort of similarity we're talking about. The first one is what we would term exact matches or cousin domains. So this is a domain where the second level domain name, which is the part of the domain name to the left of the dot, is identical to the brand name we're looking for, but on some sort of different arbitrary extension or TLD. So we might be looking for things like, Apple Online and so on, Apple.online, sorry, and so on. The second type is homoglyph matches, which is where one or more characters in the brand term has been replaced by a non-Latin character which appears visually similar. And the third type are fuzzy matches, and we talk about typos of degree 1. So what we mean there are typos or misspellings that affect a single character. And what that means is it covers things like a missing character, an additional character, one pair of swapped or transposed characters, and other types of character replacements. In the study, we're going to be looking at new registrations, re-registrations, and also drops. So those are domains that have been allowed to lapse. And those are all the different types of what we call domain registration activity events that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to be using a 1-year monitoring period, which actually covers between August and August 2021 to 2022. Now, really, what we're actually interested in here is looking at registrations by third parties. And the idea of looking at these similar registrations is we're aiming to look for things that have been registered to be deliberately deceptive or potentially infringing. And part of the reason why the infringers may have registered non-identical variants of these types may be to try and circumvent detection events through things like brand monitoring services that are just looking for the exact brand name. In terms of the rationale, what we're really looking to do here is to look to see if these similar domains have infringing or potentially infringing content associated with them. And hopefully I'm not going to be giving too much away by saying that that is in fact what we do see. And what that allows us to do kind of going forward is we can use this measure of similarity to be a measure of the level of threat that a domain that we find is likely to pose in the future. So next, just a word or two about the technology that we're using to do this analysis. So the domain monitoring is done using our 3D domain security and enforcement technology, which is kind of a central part of our DomainSec platform, which is really the cloud-based cybersecurity platform that we use for all of our domain management and brand protection services. And really what this allows us to do is have everything running in one place together and to have all the different component parts of those products talking to each other. So what that allows us to do is use things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and clustering technology to kind of find links between infringements we find in different parts of those services and really allow us to sort of drill down to what the key findings are. I guess the other thing to take away is that the 3D domain monitoring itself is somewhat of a step up from the sort of old, more familiar kind of basic domain monitoring we have. You can see that at the top right here. What we're able to do if we're looking for a particular type of brand term, we can automatically get the system to look for fuzzy matches, homoglyphs, and so on. And really what the system is able to do is learn what types of variations it's seen previously and kind of automatically evolve its monitoring to look for more of the same. But really the key thing there is that the 3D monitoring allows us to look for all of these fuzzy homoglyph matches and so on, which is the focus of what we're doing here. So now we're ready to dive into the findings in detail. So on the right here, you can see a graph showing the overall daily levels of activity across the 1 year period. You can see the three coloured lines there representing the new registrations, the re-registrations, and the drop domains. Obviously the data is quite noisy, and don't worry too much about the details there, but really the things to take away is that we're really seeing continuous activity across that period. We're seeing a lot of activity overall, so there's over 11,000 domain activity events in total. So those are instances of registrations, re-registrations, or drops on any given day. And you can see, obviously, we see spikes and troughs. Individual spikes can in some cases be tied to specific events or registration campaigns. So for example, on the 27th of August 2021, we had what was presumably one single entity registering 56 different misspellings of mcdonalds.co.uk. And you can see the details of some of the other individual clusters that we saw within the data there. And this is kind of a little bit similar to sorts of things we've seen previously. So one of our previous studies, we noticed that there was a peak in domain registrations relating to pharmaceutical companies and energy-related keywords coinciding with the launch of the Energize program. What that was a collaboration between 10 pharma companies to really engage their suppliers in environmental initiatives to combat climate change. And really off the back of that, we saw people registering related domain names. And that's a kind of common theme we've seen in many of our previous studies, where in some cases a real-world event can trigger a corresponding period of activity following it. Once we drill down into that data set in a bit more detail, what we find is that of those 11,000 odd domain activity events, there are actually a little over 8,500 unique domain names within the data set. So what that means really is that the same domain names can sometimes appear more than once in the data set. And that will happen, for example, if the domain name is registered and then dropped, both within the monitoring period we're looking at. So those 8,500 domain names, that will really be the focus of what we're looking at for the rest of this study. The first thing to do really is to look at who those domains are registered to. And actually we find that of those 8,500, only 72 of the domains, so less than 1%, are actually registered by the brand owners, probably representing things like defensive registrations. The remainder, so the vast majority, 8,480, are third-party domains. So these are all domains with names that are similar to the official brands that we're looking at, but they've been registered by third parties and therefore potentially are infringing. Within that data set, we do see the different types of brand variant that we talked about earlier. So the exact matches to the brand name, the so-called cousin domains, and the domains with the missing characters, extra characters, swapped characters, and replaced characters. And on the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about how those different categories break down. So on this slide, we're going to look at the breakdown of the brand variant or match types that we talked about on the previous slide. The left-hand graph represents the full data set, and then you can see half of that are the domains where we see one or more replaced characters, which is summarized by the graph on the right-hand side. Overall, what we're seeing is that 3% of the domains feature an exact match to the targeted brand name, so that's these cousin domains. 44% featured a missing or extra character. 3% feature transposed or swapped characters, and 50% feature one or more replaced characters. And you can see that on the right-hand side, the vast majority of the domains with the replaced characters are seeing just one or two characters being replaced in the domain names we're picking up. In total, just over 3% of the data set featured homoglyph domains. So these are the ones incorporating the non-ASCII, the non-Latin characters. So we've mentioned that the domains with multiple character substitutions tend to generally be the homoglyph domain names, and that's partly because the fuzzy match searches are explicitly focusing on the close matches with only a single character differing from the search term. But really, the overall thing to take away here is that all of these domain names we're finding will be very similar to the targeted brand name by definition, so they will present a high potential for confusion and significant threat to those brands, and obviously what that does is it presents a risk of infringing use by bad actors, so the people who've registered those domain names, for things like phishing activity and other traffic misdirection. So next, we've just got a couple of quick slides looking at some of the top features within that domain data set. So that's that set of about 8,500 third-party domains that we found. This slide here is showing you the top TLDs or domain extensions represented within that data set. And really, the sort of patterns that we see here are sort of going to be familiar from what we've seen from previous studies looking at infringing content. So they tend to be dominated by things like popular TLDs, which have large numbers of registrations generally. So that will be things like .com, and new GTLDs. So that will be things like your .xyz, .top. We've seen those previously to be popular with infringers. So again, it's not surprising to see them in this data set here. This slide is showing the most commonly observed brand variants where a pair of adjacent characters in the term we're looking for have been swapped. So really just kind of giving you a flavor of what some of those typos look like. In total, 253 of the domains we found were found to incorporate these transposed or swapped characters. This is just the top 10, but it gives you an idea of the types of variants that are being used. So next we're going to focus on the domains that incorporate character replacements. We're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into what types of character replacements we've seen. Overall, within the data set of unique domains, we saw something like 3,000 individual replaced characters. And what we've done here is we split that out, and we've got top 10s for the instances where a character is replaced by another Latin character on the left, and instances on the right where a character is replaced by a non-Latin character. So that will tend to be a number or an accented character of some sort, of some type. A couple of things to say about this analysis. So when we were looking at the replaced characters, what we did was we excluded any examples where the replaced character version formed an alternative word in its own right. So to give you a couple of examples, if we're looking at the Apple brand and we're looking at things that differ by one character, some of the things that will match for Apple with a fuzzy one character match will be things like apply or ample. They're both the same as Apple, but just differ by one character. But obviously, they are unlikely to be intended as deceptive variants of the brand name. So anything that forms an alternative word, we exclude. And similarly, we actually didn't look at any of the character replacements for the Visa brand because it's got quite a small number of characters and it's quite a generic term. And we find that, again, if we use fuzzy matching, it will pick up things like Lisa and Vita and other things that are really unrelated to the brand name. However, looking at what we do see in a bit more detail, what we find is that in most cases, the characters tended to have been replaced by visually similar alternatives to create a convincing lookalike domain name. So things like, the replacement of an O with a small character over it, which may not be easily visible in a web browser. There are some instances, however, where we do see slightly different types of matches. So what we're finding is that in some cases, characters have been replaced by other characters that are adjacent to them on a keyboard. So that will be things like an N replacing for an M, an O replacing for an I, a G replacing for a B, and so on. And what we're assuming there is that those are presumably intending to try and catch misdirected traffic arising from browser requests containing common typing errors. It's also worth noting that some of the common character replacements we do see might relate to actual third-party brand use or unrelated terms. So, for example, all of the G to M replacements that we saw actually use the term Moogle, which we're assuming is a typo for Google, but actually Moogle is the name of a creature in the Final Fantasy gaming series. So there is a possibility that some of what we're seeing is kind of being mixed in with some real third-party use as well. So we're now going to look in a little bit of detail at the registrant and registrar characteristics of the domain within the dataset. So the registrant is the domain owner, the registrar is the organization through which the domain has been registered or purchased. So overall, we found WHOIS or domain ownership information for about 4,500 of the domains. And then within that, about 3,000, so about 2/3 of the ones where information is available, used domain privacy services or had redacted registration information. Now, while that's not entirely unfamiliar or surprising in the kind of realm of GDPR, what that might indicate is that there's some attempt by the domain owner to mask their identity, and that can be an indicator of nefarious intentions or infringing use. What the tables and the graphs there are showing you really is the top registrants, the top registrars, and the top registrant countries represented within the data set. I'm not going to go through that in too much detail, but one of the sort of really key things to take away is that the registrar landscape is dominated by these consumer-grade providers. And this is a trend that we've previously seen in other studies where we've been looking at domains that have been registered potentially for infringing use. So now we're going to move on to some cybersecurity, fraud protection, and brand protection considerations. And really what that means is looking at any associated website content and what the domains may be doing or what they may be used for. Overall, about 4,500 domains, so a little over half of the ones we found in our dataset were still registered at the time of analysis. So that will be the ones where the most recent domain activity event is something other than a domain drop. Of the domains that are still registered, about 2,500, so again just over half of the registered ones, produced a live website response indicating that there may be some sort of website content associated with them. Within that, we saw a range of different content types, as we'll show you some examples of that on the next slide. Several of the sites were found to display pay-per-click links or holding pages offering the domain name for sale, and that's an indication that the domains are being monetized. So maybe they have been registered purely to generate revenue, or they've been registered to generate traffic and be attractive, possibly with a view to being sold on later. And many of them also displayed browser warnings indicating that threatening content is or was formerly present. So even when there's no live web page content now, there may have been some infringing or threatening content there previously. Just under 1,600 of the domains were configured with active MX records. So what that's telling you is it's indicating that they can send or receive emails, and that's what we'd expect to see if there's a possibility that the domains are being used in a phishing attack. The final thing to say is that even amongst the domains that don't have any site content at the moment, what we would term a dormant domain, sometimes those have the potential to be used fraudulently in the future. So what we sometimes see is that domains are registered well in advance of when they intended when they're intended to be weaponized. So really, if we find these dormant, inactive domains, it's quite often useful to monitor them for changes to configuration status and site content, so that you can be alerted if the threatening content does appear in the future. Here are some domains that we found within the domain data set that had live site content and appeared to be infringing or targeting the brand in some way. So bear in mind, everything that we're looking at here has a domain name which is very, very similar to the brand name which is being targeted or attacked, and the site content is kind of taking advantage of that brand in some way. We'll go through them from sort of left to right and top to bottom. You can see that they're labeled A, B, C, D, E, F down the right-hand side, giving you an idea of the type of content. And in bold, in each case, what we've got is the second level domain name. So again, the part of the domain name to the left of the dot, so you can see exactly what types of brand variants were being used. So overall, we're seeing a range of different types of content, including things like passing off, unauthorized use of intellectual property, misdirection of web traffic, and so on. So I'll just go through them very quickly. Top left, A is a lookalike site, so that is not the Google website, but obviously looks exactly like it and has a domain name that is very similar. The second example is a potential phishing site. So this is something that was purporting to be the McDonald's loyalty club, but is registered to a third party and is entirely unrelated to McDonald's. C at the top right is a kind of lookalike site using official branding. So again, it looks very much like a sort of Amazon branded shopping website, but it's not owned by Amazon and potentially is associated with fraudulent activity. At the bottom left there, what we're seeing is an example excuse me, of a site with similar branding. So this is a site calling themselves Armazon rather than Amazon, using a sort of similar style of branding, if you can see in the very, very small logo at the top left of that site. And in this case, associated with the sale of firearms. So a sort of real negative brand association. The fifth example is an example of traffic misdirection. So this is an independent search engine website that has registered a Google-like domain name, but is then redirecting that to their own competitor search engine site. The final example is just an example of a different type of brand infringement. So this is, you can see a domain using the name Fakebook rather than Facebook. And what that site is actually doing, it's actually selling what it terms high trust accounts for advertising. So probably what they are doing is they are probably setting up Facebook accounts. They are incorporating things like clickbait, getting them to generate likes and comments so that those postings and accounts become very popular. And then they are selling those accounts that by that point have become trusted and popular to third parties who can use them for their own advertising purposes. So now we're going to look in a little bit more detail at the homoglyph domains. So as you recall, those will be the domains where one or more character is replaced by a non-Latin character, generally one that is intended to appear visually similar. Overall, 3% of the domains in our dataset featured homoglyph replacements, and 10% of these were configured with active MX records. So again, that's really concerning because these very convincing lookalikes could potentially be being used for phishing activity. Now, in most cases, most of the domains, as we saw earlier, feature small numbers of character replacements, but there were 33 domains in the dataset where at least half the characters were replaced by homoglyphs, and you can see a couple of the examples there. The really kind of worrying thing about this dataset, of course, though, is that numerous examples were present in the dataset where all of the replaced characters looked almost identical to the characters that they were being replacing, or appeared to just be in a different font. So if you look on the right-hand side here, there's a table of some of the most convincing lookalikes that we found within the dataset. In most cases, they just differ from the official brand name by just one or two characters, and the non-Latin character that's been replaced is highlighted in red to make it easier to see here. Now, obviously, if you were to see these domain names in a in a browser address bar, you wouldn't see that red highlighting. And if you were to see something like, if you look down some of the Google matches down the right-hand side, if you look at that one 6 down, if you were to see that in a browser address bar, I would imagine that the vast majority of people would not notice that those two O's are different to each other. One is a non-Latin O, one is a Latin O. But obviously that is a completely separate domain name from google.com, so really could form the basis of a very, very convincing infringement. So this slide just shows a table of different character replacements that we'd seen. So in total, 183 distinct non-Latin characters were used as replacements for Latin characters across the data set that we found, and those replaced characters are shown here. And really just a couple of things to take away from this. One is really the range of creativity that the infringers are using when they're creating these lookalike domain names. You can see there's almost a whole line of different types of character that appear to be very similar to an E, just with different accents and so on. And really the other thing to take away is just how similar some of these characters look to their Latin equivalents. So for example, if you look at some of the I's, for example, ones with a small dot underneath it or no dot at all, I would say, again, in most cases, if you were to see that in a browser address bar, you'd be very, very hard pushed to see that that's not a regular character. So finally, we're just going to go over a summary and some key takeaways. So just to go back over the key findings, so you'll recall that we saw over 11,000 domain registration activity events, that's registrations, re-registrations and domain drops in the space of a year, targeting those 10 global brands. Within that data set, we saw approximately 8,500 unique domain names, and almost all of those, so well over 99%, were registered to third parties. 2/3 of the domains used domain privacy services or had redacted registration information, so again, they're an indication that the owners are trying to hide their identity. And the registrar profile is dominated by consumer-grade registrars, which again is a common theme we've seen in infringing registrations. Around 4,500 of domains, so about 54%, were still registered at the time of analysis, of which about 56% resolved to a live website, and 35% were configured with active MX records. So again, that's indicating potential email capabilities. And really the most worrying thing is that the data set includes actually quite a large number of examples with very significant potential for confusion with official domains. So you've got some examples shown there. And as we've seen on the previous slides, many of those are actually actively being used for brand impersonations or other types of infringement. So what does all this tell us? Really what it shows us is the degree to which trusted brands can be targeted by bad actors, and obviously that presents significant threats to their security postures, revenue and reputations. It also really highlights the need for domain intelligence and domain monitoring as part of a wider brand protection initiative. This was all done, as we mentioned, using our 3D domain security and enforcement technology powered by DomainSec. And this technology is able to provide this overview for us and for our brand owner customers as part of our ongoing services. Really what it allows us to do is have visibility of domain activity, encompassing all of the different types of brand variant that we've been looking at. So things like the fuzzy matches, including the typos and homoglyphs, but we can also look at things like sound-alike variations, and it covers a wide range of domain name extensions or TLDs. We've also mentioned that this system incorporates this MLDS, so the machine learning deep search technology. And what that's allowing us to do is intelligently modify the monitoring based on the previously identified infringements. Really, the final thing to take away is that these close matched domain names are highly likely in general to be used for malicious or infringing activity. So what that allows us to do is to use the closeness of the match of a third-party brand name to that of the brand owner's official brand name website as a key input into an algorithm that can help us determine the level of threat that might be posed by that domain in the future. And these types of ideas are central to the idea of threat scoring, which is a kind of framework of ideas that we're continuing to develop, which can be used to prioritize infringements for analysis, future monitoring, and help to highlight enforcement targets.